The Forgotten Warrior. The battlefield was quiet now. Smoke and fire rose from the ruins of war. Bodies of soldiers, both human and alien, lay scattered across the ground. The war between humans and the Zavarian Empire had raged for years, and this was just another bloody fight. In the middle of it all, Zurich, a Zavarian warrior, lay on the cold, cracked ground. His body was covered in deep wounds, his breathing weak. His silver-blue blood pooled beneath him. His people had abandoned him. They had seen him fall, looked at his injuries, and decided he was not worth saving. Zurich knew the rules of his kind. A wounded warrior was a weak warrior. The Zavarian Empire had no place for weakness. The sound of footsteps made him open his eyes. His sharp vision blurred. A group of human soldiers moved across the field, checking the dead. Zurich had expected death today, but not like this, not left behind, alone, forgotten. One human stood apart from the others. Sergeant Jake Carter scanned the area carefully. His armor was scratched, his rifle strapped to his back. He had seen many battles, lost many friends, but something about the wounded alien caught his eye. Zurich barely had the strength to lift his head. His deep violet eyes locked onto the human. Would this be the one to end him? Jake raised his rifle, but he didn't fire. The alien was badly hurt. If he wanted to kill them, it would be easy. But something inside Jake hesitated. "Sergeant, let's move." "He's done for," one of his men called. Jake didn't move. He had seen aliens fight. They were ruthless, strong, and fast. But this one, he was breathing, struggling, still alive. Zurich coughed, his body shaking. He expected a final shot, a quick death. Instead, he felt hands gripping his arm, lifting him, helping him sit up. He frowned. Why was this human helping him? Jake sighed. "You're lucky I'm not like them," he muttered. The other soldiers looked at Jake like he was crazy. "What are you doing?" "He's the enemy." "He's dying," Jake replied. "I'm not leaving him here." One of the soldiers scoffed. "He wouldn't do the same for you." Jake knew that was probably true, but he didn't care. War had taken enough lives. Maybe saving one, enemy or not, was the right thing to do. Zurich groaned as Jake helped him stand. His body was weak, his legs barely able to hold him. The human was strong, steady. Zurich didn't understand. His people had left him, but this human, his enemy, was carrying him. The others didn't argue anymore. They were used to Jake's stubbornness. They just shook their heads and walked ahead, leaving him behind. Jake wrapped Zurich's arm around his shoulder, dragging him toward cover. "If command finds out, I'm dead," he thought. But he had already made his choice. Zurich tried to speak, but his voice was hoarse. "Why? Why do you help?" Jake smirked. "Because I can." Behind them, the battlefield was silent. The war would continue. But in that moment, two enemies became something different. Not warriors, not enemies, just two soldiers, one saving the other. And that choice would change everything. The escape begins. The weight of Zurich's body pressed heavily against Jake's shoulder. The alien warrior was struggling to stay conscious, his deep wounds leaking silver-blue blood onto the human's armor. The battlefield behind them was eerily silent, but Jake knew that silence never lasted long in war. They had to move. Fast. The rest of the squad had already disappeared into the shadows, leaving Jake behind. They had no time for a wounded enemy, no patience for Jake's mercy. To them, Zurich was dead the moment he fell. But Jake wasn't like them. Zurich groaned, his breath ragged. "This is foolish, human." His voice was weak, but the pride of a warrior still clung to every word. "You gain nothing by helping me." Jake tightened his grip. "Shut up and walk." The alien's legs trembled, but he forced himself forward. It was humiliating, a Zavarian warrior being carried by a human. His people would rather see him die. They had abandoned him. And yet this human, an enemy, refused to let him fall. They moved through the ruined landscape, every step slow and painful. The ground was uneven, littered with the remains of war, shattered weapons, broken helmets, the bodies of the fallen. The smell of smoke and blood thickened the air. Jake's mind raced. Where can I take him? Where can I hide him? The human military camp was out of the question. If command found out he was protecting the Zavarian, he'd be court-martialed, maybe even executed for treason. And Zurich, they'd put a bullet in his head the second they saw him. Zurich must have sensed the hesitation. "You cannot save me," he rasped. "Not from your kind. Not from mine." Jake ignored him. He wasn't the type to leave people behind, no matter who they were. After what felt like an eternity, they'd reached the ruins of an old outpost, one that had been abandoned months ago after an airstrike. The structure was barely standing, but it was enough. Jake kicked open a rusted door and dragged Zurich inside, lowering him onto a pile of old supply crates. "You're not dying on me," Jake muttered, ripping open a med kit from his belt. He pulled out a disinfectant pad and reached for Zurich's wounds. The alien flinched, his fangs bared. "Do not touch me." Jake rolled his eyes. "You'd rather bleed out." Zurich didn't answer. His body was shaking from blood loss. "Yeah, thought so." Jake pressed the pad against the worst of the wounds. Zurich hissed in pain, but didn't fight back. For the first time in his life, Zurich felt powerless. He was a warrior, a soldier raised to fight, to conquer, to never show weakness. And yet here he was, injured, helpless, being saved by a human. The silence between them grew heavy. After a while, Zurich finally spoke. "What do you hope to gain from this?" Jake didn't answer right away. He tied a tight bandage around Zurich's shoulder, then sat back against the cold wall, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, man," he sighed, "I don't know what you think of humans. I don't care. But where I come from, we don't leave people to die. Not if we can help it." Zurich studied him with tired, unreadable eyes. He had always believed humans were weak because of their emotions, because of their attachments. But now he wasn't so sure. Before either of them could say another word, a sharp noise cut through the air. Footsteps, voices. Jake's heart slammed against his ribs. Someone was outside. Human patrol. Zavarian search party. He reached for his rifle and quickly moved to the doorway, pressing himself against the wall. Zurich, despite his injuries, forced himself upright, his claws flexing. The voices grew closer. Jake tightened his grip on his weapon. Had they already been found? Was this the end? Zurich bared his fangs. If he was going to die, he would die fighting. But Jake wasn't ready to give up yet. He took a slow breath. No matter who was outside, he was going to make sure they survived. A warrior's shame, a human's honor. The footsteps outside grew louder. Jake held his breath, his rifle steady against his shoulder. Zurich, despite his wounds, crouched beside him, his sharp claws flexed, ready for a last stand. Then the voices faded. The footsteps moved past the outpost, disappearing into the night. Jake exhaled slowly, lowering his weapon. That was close. Zurich didn't relax. His body was tense, his mind still sharp despite the pain. He had been trained to expect deception. If you lower your guard, you die. But no attack came. Jake turned back to him. "All right, you need rest." Zurich scoffed. "Rest is for the weak." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Yeah? Well, bleeding to death is for idiots." Zurich narrowed his eyes, but he had no strength to argue. He sat down against the cold metal wall, his body heavy with exhaustion. Jake sat across from him, pulling a canteen from his belt. He unscrewed the cap and took a sip before tossing it toward Zurich. The alien caught it with one clawed hand and hesitated. Zavarians never took food or drink from outsiders. It was a matter of pride. But right now, his pride had already been broken. Slowly, he lifted the canteen to his lips and drank. Jake smirked. See, not so bad. Zurich set the canteen down beside him. You saved my life. Yeah, Jake said, stretching his arms. And you're real ungrateful about it. Zurich's expression darkened. You do not understand. Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. So explain it to me. Zurich stared at him, unsure how to put it into words. He was no longer a warrior, no longer a soldier. He had been abandoned, left to die. In my culture, Zurich said, his voice quiet but firm, a warrior who is left behind is considered weak. A disgrace. If I return, I will not be welcomed. I will not be honored. I will be nothing. Jake frowned. So, they'd rather let you die than help you. Yes. Jake shook his head in disbelief. That's messed up. Zurich let out a low breath. It is the way of my people. Jake studied him. He could see the shame in Zurich's posture, the way he sat rigid, his claws clenched, his jaw tight. Zurich didn't want to be here. He didn't want to be saved. He wanted to fight, to die in battle. That was the Zavarian way. Too bad Jake didn't give a damn about that. Yeah, well, Jake said, where I come from, we don't leave people behind, no matter what. Zurich looked at him, something unreadable in his violet eyes. And for that, you are called weak. Jake let out a short laugh. Maybe. But at least I can sleep at night. Silence stretched between them. For the first time, Zurich truly looked at this human. Jake Carter wasn't like the others. He wasn't a killer. He wasn't a conqueror. He was something else. A strange thought crept into Zurich's mind, one he never would have considered before today. Perhaps this human was stronger than any Zavarian warrior. The desperate plan. The night stretched on. Zurich drifted in and out of sleep, his body weak, his mind clouded. When the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the ruined outpost, Jake was already awake. We can't stay here, Jake said. They'll come looking. Zurich grunted. And where do you suggest we go? Jake hesitated. He knew one place, one person who might help, but it was risky. An old friend of mine, Jake said. He runs an underground supply station outside enemy territory. No one asks questions there. Zurich's brow furrowed. And you trust him? Jake shrugged. I trust him enough. Zurich didn't like it. He didn't like relying on anyone. But at this point, he had no choice. We move at sundown, Jake said. Zurich nodded. Then we move. The journey begins. Night fell once more. Jake and Zurich moved carefully through the shadows, staying low, avoiding the patrols that hunted both of them now. At one point, Zurich stumbled. His wounds still hadn't fully healed. Jake caught him before he could hit the ground. Easy, Jake muttered. Zurich pulled away. I do not need your help. Jake rolled his eyes. Yeah, tell that to your legs. Zurich growled, but kept moving. Hours passed. The distant sounds of battle echoed in the background. But out here, in the ruins of war, it was quiet. Then, Jake spotted something in the distance, a small, hidden bunker beneath a collapsed tower. There, he whispered. Zurich followed his gaze. And you are certain we will be safe? Jake sighed. Nope. Zurich exhaled slowly. Then let us hope you are lucky, human. Jake grinned. I don't believe in luck. They approached the bunker cautiously. Jake tapped a sequence on the rusted metal door. For a long moment, there was no response. Then the door creaked open. A tall, rugged man stood inside, his sharp green eyes flicking between Jake and the wounded alien. Jake, the man said, you really know how to pick your friends. Jake smirked. Yeah, I get that a lot. Zurich tensed, his claws flexing. He didn't trust this human. He didn't trust any human. But right now, trust didn't matter. Survival did. And the real fight was only just beginning. The rescue mission that no one wants. The metal door groaned as it swung open. Inside the dimly lit bunker, the air was thick with dust and the scent of oil and gunpowder. The man standing in the doorway was tall, rugged, with sharp green eyes that flicked between Jake and Zurich. He had the look of someone who had seen too much, lost too much, and cared too little. "Jake," he said, arms crossed. "You really know how to pick your friends." Jake exhaled. "Good to see you too, Reynolds." Zurich tensed, shifting slightly to a defensive stance. He didn't trust this human. He didn't trust any humans. But right now, trust was a luxury he didn't have. He was barely standing, his body still weak from his injuries, and if Jake had brought him here, then this man was his only chance at survival. Reynolds studied Zurich with open skepticism. "You're joking, right? You dragged a half-dead Zavarian warrior all the way here." Jake shrugged. "Look, I need supplies. Medical. Food. Somewhere safe to rest for a few hours." Reynolds scoffed. "You do realize what you're asking?" Jake gave a lopsided grin. "Yep." Reynolds ran a hand over his stubbled chin. "You're insane." Jake's grin widened. "Yeah, I get that a lot." Reynolds sighed, stepping aside. "Fine. Get in before I change my mind." Jake motioned for Zurich to follow, and they stepped inside. The bunker was small but well-stocked, lined with stolen military supplies, weapons, and survival gear. A few dim lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows along the steel walls. Zurich sat down heavily on a crate, his breathing uneven. He was exhausted, but he refused to show it. Reynolds narrowed his eyes. "So, what's the deal? You saving this guy out of the kindness of your heart?" Jake grabbed a canteen from the shelf and took a swig. "Something like that." Reynolds let out a humorless chuckle. "You do realize the minute command finds out, you're dead, right?" Jake wiped his mouth. "Figured as much." Reynolds shook his head. "You always were an idiot." A desperate plan. Reynolds tossed Jake a medkit, nodding toward Zurich. "You patch him up. I'll figure out how to get you out of here before someone comes sniffing around." Jake crouched next to Zurich, pulling open the medkit. "All right, hold still." Zurich eyed the human warily. "I do not need." Yeah, Jake muttered, cutting him off. "You don't need help. You're a proud warrior. I've heard it all before. Now shut up and let me do this." Zurich growled but didn't stop him. As Jake worked, Reynolds leaned against the metal wall, arms crossed. "You do realize the only way this ends is badly, right? Even if you fix him up, even if you get him out of here, his own people don't want him back." Jake didn't look up. "Yeah, I know." Reynolds continued. "So, what's the plan?" "Keep running. There's nowhere safe for him. Not with humans, not with his kind." Jake finished wrapping the bandages around Zurich's arm, then sat back on his heels. He didn't have an answer. Zurich finally spoke, his voice low. "Then we do not run." Jake and Reynolds both looked at him. "We fight." Reynolds let out a short laugh. "Fight? Against who?" Zurich clenched his jaw. "Against the ones who abandoned me. Against those who would rather see me dead." Jake raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly do you plan on doing that? You can barely stand." Zurich's violet eyes burned with quiet fury. "Give me time." Reynolds sighed. "You're both idiots." Jake smirked. "Yeah, well, I'd rather be an idiot than a coward." Reynolds groaned. "Fine. You need weapons. I've got them. But after this, you're on your own." Zurich nodded. "Understood." Breaking into the military base. The plan was simple. Steal medical supplies. Steal weapons. Get out. The problem. They had to break into a heavily guarded military base to do it. Reynolds had access to old security routes, blueprints of the compound, and most importantly, an inside contact. But even with all that, the mission was dangerous. That night, Jake and Zurek moved through the ruins, heading toward the edge of human-occupied territory. Jake checked his gear. All right. The security shift changes in 20 minutes. That gives us a small window to get in and out. Zurek flexed his claws. His wounds were still healing, but his strength was returning. He wouldn't be at full power yet, but he didn't need to be. They slipped through the fence undetected. The compound was massive, rows of metal buildings lined up in perfect formation. The sound of guards patrolling echoed through the air. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows. They reached the supply room without being spotted. Jake began unlocking the door while Zurek kept watch. Then, a flashlight beam swept over them. "Hey, you there?" They had been spotted. Jake cursed under his breath. Time to move. Zurek didn't hesitate. He lunged. The guard barely had time to react before Zurek knocked him unconscious. Jake yanked open the door, grabbing whatever supplies he could. Zurek grabbed weapons, his hands moving fast, loading his belt with stolen gear. Then, alarms blared. "Crap," Jake muttered. "Time's up." Footsteps pounded toward them. They ran. Shots rang out behind them. Jake fired back, but there were too many. Zurek turned to fight, but Jake grabbed his arm. "No, not now. We run." Zurek snarled but followed. The exit was just ahead. Then, a bullet tore through Jake's side. He stumbled, falling against the wall. Zurek turned, eyes wide. Jake was bleeding badly. For the first time, Zurek had to make a choice: run and survive, or carry Jake and risk his own life. He didn't hesitate. Zurek grabbed Jake and hauled him onto his shoulder. Bullets whizzed past them, but Zurek pushed forward. A stolen grenade, a desperate throw. Boom. Smoke filled the air. Zurek ran, and they vanished into the night. The warrior rises again. Zurek's lungs burned as he ran, Jake's body slung over his shoulder. The weight of the human was nothing compared to the storm of thoughts raging in his mind. Why had he turned back? Why had he saved Jake? The Xaverian way was simple: survive, fight, win. The weak were left behind. The unworthy were forgotten. That was what he had been taught since birth. And yet, he had carried this human. Bullets zipped past them, tearing through the air. The explosion from Zurek's stolen grenade had bought them precious seconds, but he could already hear soldiers regrouping. They wouldn't have much time. Jake groaned weakly, his blood dripping down Zurek's armor. "Stay awake, human," Zurek growled, gripping him tighter. Jake let out a weak chuckle. "Didn't know you cared." Zurek gritted his teeth. "I do not." But he did. Zurek spotted the meeting point, an abandoned water treatment plant on the outskirts of the ruined city. Reynolds was supposed to be waiting with a vehicle, but as Zurek burst through the rusted gate, he saw nothing but darkness. No lights. No sign of Reynolds. Zurek cursed. Had he been betrayed? Had Reynolds run? Jake let out a ragged breath. We got screwed, huh?" Zurek ignored him. His eyes scanned the area, his ears twitching for any sound. Nothing. They were alone. He laid Jake down on a flat piece of metal, pressing a hand against the human's wound. Blood oozed between his fingers. It was bad. Too bad. Jake gritted his teeth. "You should go." Zurek glared at him. "Do not waste your breath." "You got what you needed," Jake rasped. "Weapons. Supplies. I'm just slowing you down." Zurek's claws flexed. This is what he should do. Leave the weak behind. Keep moving. But when he looked at Jake, something inside him refused. "No," Zurek said simply. Jake chuckled again, though it was weaker this time. "You're a terrible soldier." A low hum suddenly filled the air. Zurek's head snapped up. Engines. Bright lights pierced the darkness. A vehicle screeched to a halt just outside the gate. Zurek grabbed his weapon, preparing to fight. Then, A familiar voice rang out. "Calm down, alien. I didn't hit you." Reynolds. Zurek narrowed his eyes as the human stepped out of the vehicle, rifle in hand. "Took you long enough," Jake muttered. Reynolds glanced at Jake's bloody form. "Dan, you look worse than usual." Zurek growled. "He needs medical attention. Now." Reynolds sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Fine. Get him in the truck." Zurek didn't hesitate. He lifted Jake effortlessly, placing him in the back seat. The vehicle was old but sturdy, the interior packed with stolen supplies and weapons. Reynolds slid into the driver's seat. "We need to move." Every patrol within 5 miles heard that explosion. Zurek climbed in beside him, his claws still flexed. He didn't trust this human. But right now, there was no choice. As the vehicle roared to life and sped into the night, Jake's head lolled to the side. His breath was shallow. Zurek watched him for a long moment. He was no longer just an injured human, no longer just an enemy. Jake Carter had saved him. And now Zurek owed him a life debt. The hideout. Hours passed. The vehicle bounced over rough terrain, deeper into the war-torn outskirts. Reynolds drove in silence, his eyes locked on the road. Zurek kept his attention on Jake. The human's face was pale, his breathing uneven. "We are running out of time," Zurek said. Reynolds grunted. "I know a guy. A doctor. No questions asked." Zurek's claws tightened. He hated relying on humans. He hated being at their mercy. But Jake had saved him. And now Zurek would not let him die. The hideout was a small, abandoned structure hidden beneath an old transport station. It smelled of damp metal and old oil. The moment they arrived, a grizzled man stepped out to meet them. "Reynolds," the man grumbled. "Didn't think I'd see you again." Yeah, Reynolds said, waving him off. "We need help. Now." The man eyed Jake's wounds. "He doesn't have long." Zurek growled. "Then fix him." The man raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. Jake was carried inside, placed on a makeshift table. The doctor worked quickly, cleaning the wound, stitching flesh, sealing what he could. Zurek stood motionless, watching every movement, every cut, every drop of blood. Reynolds leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Didn't know aliens could care so much. Zurek didn't look at him. "He is not dying." Reynolds smirked. "And what if he does?" Zurek's claws dug into his palms. "Then I will burn everything." The recovery. Time blurred. Zurek did not leave Jake's side. The human was weak but alive. His breathing steadied. His color slowly returned. Days passed. Then, Jake's eyes fluttered open. He groaned. "Still alive." Zurek leaned forward. "Barely." Jake smirked. "Guess that means you still owe me." Zurek scoffed. "It means I now owe you nothing." But they both knew that wasn't true. They had saved each other. And now they were something else. Not enemies. Not just soldiers. Something more. Jake's smirk faded. "What now?" Zurek looked toward the door, his sharp eyes scanning the outside world. "We stop running," Zurek said. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? And do what?" Zurek flexed his claws. "We fight." Jake grinned. "Now you're talking." The last stand. The night air was heavy with tension. Inside the dimly lit hideout, Zurek and Jake sat across from each other, both knowing the same truth. Running was no longer an option. Jake was still weak, his side wrapped in thick bandages, but the fire in his eyes was alive again. Zurek had been watching him recover over the past few days, his strength slowly returning, his humor creeping back. But humor wouldn't save them now. Zurek ran a clawed hand over his forearm, where the fresh scars of battle still remained. His people had abandoned him, but that didn't mean they had forgotten him. If they learned he had survived, they would come for him. And if the human military found out Jake had saved a Zavarian warrior, he would be marked a traitor. They had nowhere left to hide. That left only one option. "Reynolds," Jake said, leaning back against the metal wall. "We need weapons. Big ones." Reynolds, who had been watching them from the corner, scoffed. "You're serious?" Jake grinned. "Always." Reynolds rubbed his face. "You two are insane. Do you even hear yourselves? You want to take on both sides. The entire Zavarian army thinks you're dead, and if they find out you're alive, they'll want you executed. And the humans," he turned to Jake, "they already think you're a damn traitor." Jake shrugged. "Sounds about right." Zyrek's deep violet eyes locked onto Reynolds. "We do not expect you to fight." Reynolds let out a dry laugh. "Yeah? And what's your plan? You two just gonna storm a military base and change the fate of this war?" Jake and Zyrek exchanged a glance. Neither of them spoke, but the answer was obvious. "Yes." Reynolds groaned. "I hate you both." Jake grinned. "Love you too, buddy." Reynolds shook his head. "Fine. I've got a contact. Works inside a black market arms trade. He's got explosives, energy rifles, the works. But once we do this, there's no turning back." Zyrek cracked his knuckles. "We never intended to turn back. A dangerous deal." The next night, they moved through the ruins of the war-torn city, avoiding patrols and drones. They arrived at an abandoned warehouse, where Reynolds' contact, a smuggler named Vex, was waiting. Vex was a thin, wiry man with a cybernetic eye and a permanent smirk. He leaned against a crate filled with weapons, spinning a small knife between his fingers. Well, Vex drawled. "Reynolds, you always bring me the weirdest clients." Reynolds crossed his arms. "Just give us the gear." Vex's smirk widened. "Not so fast. These aren't exactly legal goods, you know. And I don't take credits. I take favors." Jake sighed. "Of course you do." Vex's cybernetic eye glowed red as he scanned Zyrek. "Now this one. He's interesting. A real Zavarian warrior, huh? Thought your kind didn't need human tech." Zyrek's claws twitched. "We need nothing from you." Vex chuckled. "That's so. Then why are you here?" Zyrek stepped forward, towering over the smaller man. "Because we are going to end this war." For a moment, Vex was silent. Then he let out a sharp laugh. "You? 2 soldiers against an empire." Jake smiled. "That's about right." Vex considered them for a long moment, then shrugged. "Screw it. I like crazy people. You get your weapons." He gestured to the crates. Inside, a goldmine. Plasma rifles, thermal detonators, stealth field generators, and explosives powerful enough to level a base. Jake let out a low whistle. "Now that's what I'm talking about." Vex clapped his hands together. "Enjoy. And hey, if you live long enough to owe me, remember where to find me." Zyrek grabbed a plasma rifle, running his claws over the smooth metal. "If we live long enough, I will ensure we do not owe you." Vex smirked. "I like this guy." The plan. Back at the hideout, Jake and Zyrek laid out the mission. There was only one way to send a message to both the humans and the Zavarian Empire. They had to destroy the Central War Outpost, a place where both sides stored their most dangerous technology and weapons. If they blew it up, it would cripple the war efforts on both sides. It would force them to rethink everything. Reynolds shook his head. "You're talking about blowing up the most secure compound on this planet. You do know what happens if you fail, right?" Jake smirked. "Yeah, we die." Reynolds groaned. "God, I hate you." Jake clapped him on the shoulder. "Love you too, man." Zyrek was already assembling his weapons. "Enough talk. We move at dawn." The attack begins. The sun was just beginning to rise when they arrived at the outpost. The massive compound stretched across the valley, surrounded by high walls, energy shields, and automated turrets. Soldiers from both human and Zavarian forces patrolled the perimeter. Jake adjusted his rifle. All right, we go in fast, plant the charges, and get out before the fireworks start. Reynolds, crouched beside him, sighed. You make it sound so easy. Zyrek's eyes burned with battle fury. It is not supposed to be easy. They moved quickly. The stealth fields allowed them to slip past the first wave of guards. They reached the supply depots, planting explosives along the foundation. Then, an alarm blared. Jake cursed. Damn it. We've been spotted. Gunfire erupted. Soldiers swarmed toward them. Zyrek roared, unleashing a fury unlike anything Jake had seen before. He tore through enemies with brutal efficiency, his plasma rifle blazing. He was no longer a fallen warrior. He was a force of nature. Jake covered him, taking down soldiers with precise shots. Reynolds was planting the last of the charges when a group of human soldiers rushed in. One of them froze. Carter. Jake turned, locking eyes with an old friend, Captain Rains. Rains' face twisted in anger. You're working with a Zavarian. Jake raised his rifle. I'm ending this war. Rains' jaw tightened. That's treason. Jake exhaled. Then I guess I'm a traitor. Rains raised his weapon. Jake did the same. For a moment, time froze. Then, Zyrek fired first. The shot hit Rains' gun, knocking it from his hands. Jake gave Zyrek a look. Thanks. Zyrek didn't reply. Reynolds yelled, Charges are set. We gotta go. Now. They ran, bullets flying around them. Jake hit the detonator. Boom. The explosion ripped through the compound, fire and smoke filling the sky. As they escaped into the mountains, Zyrek turned back. The war outpost, the heart of this conflict, was gone. Jake, panting, looked at him. Think they'll listen now? Zyrek watched the burning horizon. They will have no choice. The choice that changed everything. The ground still trembled from the explosion. Smoke and fire painted the sky in thick plumes of gray, the wreckage of the military outpost crumbling in the distance, the war's most valuable supply depot, its weapons, its secrets, all gone. Jake, Zyrek, and Reynolds stood on the rocky cliffside, watching as chaos erupted below. Tell me that was worth it, Reynolds muttered, his hands gripping his rifle. Zyrek's violet eyes remained locked on the destruction. It was necessary. Jake wiped soot from his face. We just crippled the biggest war operation on this planet. Both sides are going to feel this. Reynolds shook his head. Yeah. And now they're both going to be hunting us. Silence stretched between them. He wasn't wrong. The human military would brand Jake as a traitor. The Zavarian Empire would see Zyrek as even worse, a warrior who had sided with the enemy, dishonored his kind, and burned their war efforts to the ground. There was no going back. No more hiding. No more running. And that meant they had only one option left, to end the war before it ended them. The aftermath. For 3 days, the planet was in chaos. Reports flooded the airwaves. News of the outpost's destruction spread across both human and Zavarian forces. The military leaders scrambled to assess the damage, to send reinforcements, to figure out who had done this. But more than that, they hesitated. Neither side knew who was responsible. The humans suspected it was an elite Zavarian strike force. The Zavarians believed it was a secret human operation. Neither side trusted the other, but for the first time in years, they weren't attacking. Both armies were too busy questioning everything. Jake, Zyrek, and Reynolds listened to the intercepted transmissions from their underground hideout. The generals don't know what to do, Reynolds said, scrolling through reports on his cracked datapad. They're too paranoid to make a move. They're actually talking about a ceasefire. Zyrek exhaled. Good. Jake frowned. Yeah. But for how long? They're going to figure out it was us. Reynolds shrugged. Maybe. Maybe not. All that matters is what you do next. Jake exchanged a glance with Zyrek. They both knew what needed to be done. They needed to push the war to its breaking point. They needed to make sure this ceasefire became permanent. And there was only one way to do that. They had to expose the truth. The final move. They had spent years fighting under orders, killing for a cause they had never questioned. But now, they had seen the war for what it was, a cycle of destruction fueled by pride, fear, and control. Neither side wanted peace, because war was power. War was profit. Jake and Zirek had been enemies once. Now they stood side by side with a single mission: to tear down the lies that had kept this war alive. They gathered everything they had: confidential reports, intercepted messages, classified documents from the outpost before they destroyed it. All the proof that the war was never about survival, never about justice, only about control. And then they broadcasted it to the entire galaxy. Every frequency, every channel, every screen. The people, both human and Zavarian, saw the truth for the first time. The world reacts. The response was immediate. Protests broke out in human cities. Zavarian soldiers abandoned their posts. The people were tired of war, tired of fighting for leaders who had lied to them. The military tried to shut it down. They labeled Jake and Zirek as terrorists, traitors, criminals. But it was too late. The spark had been lit. The war was crumbling. The final stand. But the leaders would never give up power so easily. As the people rose up, the military sent their elite forces after one target: Jake and Zirek. They were the symbol of rebellion, the proof that the war was built on lies. If they died, the war could continue. And so, the two most powerful armies in the galaxy turned their weapons toward two soldiers who had once fought for them. Zirek stood tall, gripping his weapon. Jake smirked, checking his ammo. Guess they're mad. Reynolds let out a long sigh. You guys are gonna get me killed. Jake grinned. Probably. Zirek stepped forward, his claws flexing. Then we make our final stand count. The battle was coming. And this time, they weren't fighting for a flag. They were fighting for the future. The choice that changed everything. No one knows exactly how the final battle ended. Some say Jake and Zirek were killed, their bodies lost in the chaos. Others say they vanished, becoming myths, whispered in secret, the two warriors who ended a war. But one thing was certain: the war never restarted, because once the people knew the truth, they refused to fight for a lie. And so, the legend of the human who saved an abandoned warrior, and the warrior who saved him in return, became more than just a story. It became history.